I'm good. I got my water. Con gas. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm David Mortman. As you can see from the slide, I work for Bank of America. Nothing I talk about today will actually refer to things we do at Bank of America. I'm actually not allowed to talk about what we do internally at the bank. But what I will be talking about is why it's hard for banks and other financial institutions to start using the cloud. Obviously, I work for a bank. I know a couple of our other speakers work for a bank. Anyone else here work for a bank or other financial institution? Oh, good number of hands. I guess, you know, we all go where the money is, right? So one of the big issues is, so for the people who raise their hands about working for a bank, how many of you are using, you know, the cloud, either software as a service or infrastructure as a service? Okay, a good number, but not by far the majority. One of the issues, so Bank of America is a globally systemic financial institution, which is a fancy way of saying that we're really big. In US terms, we're one of the too big to fails, which means that when we had the financial crisis back in 2008, we were in the group of people who got like bailouts and things like that, because people were like, if the large banks fail, bad things happen to the economy. And as a result, we as a very large bank have an immense amount of regulation that we have to comply with. I was talking with someone inside the bank who was in our external audit team, and they literally are doing audits with a different governing body every single working day of the year because we're an international organization. We have like 150 million customers, and we do business on every single continent except for Antarctica. Though hopefully someday we'll have a penguin-enabled ATM, so one can only hope. But as a result, when I started the bank, one of the big questions came up, you know, how do we do this as a thing? And I talked to my peers who have worked at other banks, like, you know, how do you just start using the cloud? And one of the big issues that comes up is a number of the regulations require that that your entire stack, whether from the data center that you walk into all the way up to your software, needs to be compliant. PCI is like this for credit cards. There's a variety of US healthcare regulations. There's a number of US financial regulations that require this, and I'll get into this a little bit more later. But you can't just call up Amazon and say, hey, I want to tour the data center to ensure that you're compliant with my laundry list of regulations, which is longer than I am tall. And so today I'm going to tell you about some of the highlights of things that make meeting those regulations difficult, particularly when the regulators themselves don't quite understand cloud yet. And I'll talk more about the regulators themselves near the end because they're their own special challenge. And when I say special, I don't mean it in a good way. Okay. So one of the big issues is cryptography. Is how are you encrypting your data, whether it's at rest or in transit? And if you're encrypting that data, are you doing it in a way that will make your regulators happy, make your auditors happy, and will, most importantly, keep your customers' data secure? The last thing you want to do is, you know, be in the front page of your local newspaper or the Wall Street Journal, you know, bank loses all of customers' data. And it's bad enough when you have to, you know, okay, raise your hand if you have not had to replace your credit card in the last year. Like, I have two people who have not had to replace a credit card in the last year. 3 years? I'm impressed. I've had to swap mine twice this year already due to various compromises. The last thing you as a financial institution you want to say is, we lost all of our account numbers. You know, don't worry about credit card numbers, you know, but all of my account numbers, whether for my residential consumer customers or my large institutional investors. So one of the standard regulation pieces is that you need to be able to store your keys in a hardware security module, which is essentially, it's a special, you know, black box that is very difficult to get your keys out of. In the United States, NIST has a National Institute of Science and Technology, if I remember correctly, and they set standards for all sorts of things, everything from what the appropriate concentrations are of vinegar is to, when you buy it at the grocery store, to security things. In this case, they have a set of standards around hardware security modules, and a lot of other countries around the world have picked up on this standard because the US is the US and NIST is well recognized, much like the rest of the world who is not stupid and uses metric instead of imperial, relies on, I forget the name of the organization in France that sets the standards around the kilogram and the second and, rational measurement units, not pounds and inches, miles, weird things like that. So I spoke to probably a couple dozen banks, and the general consensus, and every bank has their own slightly different requirements, is that if you're doing data in transit, TLS, HTTPS, asymmetric cryptography, whatever you want to call it, is you have to be storing those keys in an HSM. A lot of banks like to see a level 3, some say level 2, some say level 4. The specifics of the different levels can be looked up online. They don't really matter for the context of today's conversation, but the important thing is those keys get stored. To get a little bit into the nitty gritty, this last line here is PFS is perfect forward secrecy. At a high level, it's a technology so that if you lose your TLS keys, that someone can't use those keys to recover previously encrypted data. So that's a good thing. It's a good level of protection. One of the things that people have discussed over the years is that your session keys, which are the keys that actually do the day-to-day immediate work of actually encrypting your data, can't live in an HSM while it's running, not unless you have way more money than sense. HSMs aren't designed for that high-speed transaction, so pretty much everyone will say, hey, those session keys, the ones that are doing the actual cryptography in the spur of the moment when you're actually logged into your bank or Amazon or whomever else, those can live on the servers because they don't live very long. They get destroyed when they're done, and if they're compromised, well, you only lost the data for that relatively short time period. Where things get a little more interesting is the symmetric key cryptography. This is, your data at rest. This is where people say, oh, well, we lost a set of tapes. They fell. They were on their way to the storage facility, and yes, thank you, as Taz says, it fell off the truck, or they got mislaid, or we don't actually know where they are, but they're encrypted. That's these kind of keys. Again, people like to see them stored in an HSM. This is a little bit trickier because in order to be able to decrypt data on the fly, you actually have to be able to export them out of the HSM. So it's much more of a securing that data, the keys themselves when they're not in use. Should I say this? Sure, I'll say this. People like to talk a lot about the value of you should encrypt your data at rest. Okay. Who here has said to their organization, I've said this more times than I can remember, you need to encrypt that database at rest. Anyone encrypted a database at rest? Oh, come on. Let's see some hands. I know you encrypt your databases at rest. The dirty secret here is that when your database is actually running, the data's not encrypted. And this is cloud and not cloud, it doesn't matter. If you can use your database, then the data's not encrypted. So data at rest doesn't actually protect you from, say, a SQL injection attack. What it protects you from is someone walking out of your data center with a backup tape or a hard drive. This is where data at rest encryption protects you. So one of the interesting things is the cloud providers will tell you, oh, we destroy your data. And I'll get to that, actually. That's the next slide. I'm on a roll here. Oops, I lied. I'll get back to that. So data destruction. I don't have a slide for this one. You just get to look at me instead. I'm sorry. I'm not as good looking as the people that Judy was talking about earlier, I'm afraid. So anyway, one of the issues is that you talk to your cloud providers and they'll say, we destroy your data. And what they're really saying is, we destroy the hard drive. So if a hard drive fails, or we decide not to use it anymore, we'll take it, and someone will go into the data center. It never leaves the data center intact. They throw it in a giant shredder, and it kicks out basically dust. sand, level. Like, no one's getting data back off that. But when you go to your cloud provider and you say, delete this volume or delete this file, it doesn't actually get deleted. And then people say, but I typed I typed delete or RM, or I moved it to the trash can. Well, what the cloud provider does for performance reasons is they say, oh, don't actually, it says to the servers, their backend servers, you're not allowed to look over there anymore. It's not actually removed from media, you just no longer have the ability to see it. The auditors are still a little iffy on this one. They say, well, the regulations in the US often say things like, you need to overwrite that data randomly 3 times with random ones and zeros or random other letters. It doesn't have to be ones and zeros if you're doing it at a higher level. And you can try to do that. And in fact, if you tell the cloud provider, format that drive, it'll tell you it did it. But the reality is that it doesn't actually do it on the back end. It just says, okay, it's done. And it's actually writing to separate disk. It's a whole complicated story. Ask me outside if you want to hear the realities of how that works. So this is more of an educational thing. The reality is your data is striped, is written across dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of physical disks. So if that data was encrypted, and even if it was encrypted, and you remove it, the odds of someone else finding your data on a sector on a disk and doing anything functionally useful with it are basically 0. And so this becomes sort of more of a thought exercise, a risk management exercise to help your risk people, your audit people understand the realities versus the sort of, well, what does it say on paper? And I think a lot of security is reality on one side and what we think should happen or what the rules say. And you have to find, what is an appropriate compensating control for not being able to write ones and zeros? How many times do I need to encrypt it? How many drives should be written across? And every organization is going to have a slightly different feel about that one. But to get back to our more general crypto discussion, I told you at the beginning that a lot of banks said, you need to have your TLS keys stored in an HSM. Okay, that seems pretty reasonable. And the big cloud providers, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all offer this for at least some of the services. They cover the basic core stuff. Your compute, your storage. But then someone says, I'm a SaaS provider, and I want to provide services to you as a bank, and my general architecture looks like this. Oh, and by the way, I use Elastic Load Balancer. I mean, if you're on Amazon and you have to do any load balancing, you probably use Elastic Load Balancer. It's dirt cheap. It's very effective, it scales well. If you get a lot of traffic all of a sudden, they just generate more of them magically for you. It auto scales up, it auto scales down, and it's pennies per hour. I mean, it's basically free. There's only one problem, that if you're a financial institution and you have a requirement for an HSM, well, you're kind of screwed because Amazon doesn't have an HSM backing Elastic Load Balancer or the API gateway or the certificate manager, which they will tell you some complicated story there that, again, ask me outside because it takes too long, of how they're protecting your TLS keys using data at rest encryption and storage in an AWS S3 bucket. And if you, like I said, ask me about it later, but that's a fun little thought exercise why that wouldn't be acceptable to a large financial or anyone else needing an HSM. This isn't special to Amazon. I'm picking on Amazon because a lot more people use them, but Google has similar issues. Microsoft has similar issues. IBM definitely has similar issues. You name any large cloud provider who offers services like this, they're going to have similar issues. So you have to think carefully about it. There are workarounds, but it's just not as simple as just turn it on. It's like when we tell people, oh yeah, encrypt everything, but we don't actually have any thoughts around how that would work, or Chad was saying earlier, in a lot of ways we're still stuck in network security from the 90s. In cloud, in fact, I described when I first started talking about cloud about 10 years ago as cloud is basically a lights out data center approach when you're talking about infrastructure as a service, but your security is back to network security in the 90s. I think Dave would agree with me from his time at his previous employer. Excuse me. So, I decided to separate out key management separately from cryptography because getting your data, your keys into an HSM is great, awesome. You now have met most financials requirements for storing the data securely. Or even if you're not a financial, you've just added significantly to the security of your keys, which means there's a much higher chance of that if I'm out there and I'm looking at your organization, or what I think is a website for your organization, that it probably is you if the key says it's you. Whereas if they're not stored in HSM, maybe those keys were stolen. Maybe it's someone masquerading as you. Maybe it's a phishing attack using your keys. So how do you protect those keys? There's a number of options out there. But again, just because you got them in HSM doesn't mean it's sufficient. And there are products out there, off the top of my head, the most popular one you hear about is HashiCorp Vault, but also CyberArk. Yes, CyberArk acquired a company called Console. There's a handful of others, but it's not sufficient, especially you need to be able to demonstrate to your auditors that you know where your keys are, how they're being used, how they're being managed. You also hear this called secrets management, credential management, things like this. Several of the cloud providers, all the cloud providers have things like this. One small problem, most of them aren't backed by an HSM, or they're not backed by an HSM that might meet your organization's needs. So it's suddenly, you've like, great, I now have good logging and auditing, but I can't actually say for sure whether or not those keys are my keys, or if I'm using you as a provider, you can't guarantee to me that those keys are actually secured. This becomes less of a problem in an on-premise environment when I can go in physically to your site and they say, here's our web servers, here's our HSMs, here's our log sheet of the person going into the data center with their badges. So that makes things a little bit exciting. I already talked about data destruction because I got out of order. Eventual consistency, right, for the DevOps geeks. And then there's the next one, my second to last, I think, if I recall correctly, is audit. I alluded to this earlier, which is that one of the requirements of, well, I said PCI earlier, but the Office of the Comptroller of Currency in the US is probably one of the biggest regulators, along with the Federal Reserve, of financial institutions in the US. Most countries have something similar. One of the requirements they have, if you're a large financial institution, is you need to be able to, if you're outsourcing, go to your outsourcer and validate for yourself that they are meeting your security controls that you've put upon them. So I need to be able to go to a third-party provider, say, you know, the people who are printing statements for my customers, if I'm outsourcing that. And I have to walk into their data center and they can show me all the security controls they have around the bank's customer data. And if they want to do business with us, they got us in the door, because there's gonna be a lot of money involved, and and this is sort of the rules. Well, say that processor now wants to move to Amazon for some of their compute stuff. And I'm like, okay, fine, you need to be able to go call Amazon and physically validate their security controls, and we need to be able to go to Amazon and go to you and Amazon, or if we want to use Amazon directly, go to Amazon, Microsoft, Google, whomever, and say, okay, show me your controls. Show me that you're doing that. One of the things about the cloud providers is they actually generally have better physical security than anyone else on the planet, except for a very small number of government and military data centers. So they're not about to let you come to where their data center. If they would let every organization who wanted to validate the security, they would actually be less secure, because people would know where they were physically located. It would be a much harder problem to ensure that everyone going in the door was who they claimed they were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, there's the regulatory requirement to do it. And so the big question becomes, how do I, as a regulated entity, work with, again, I'll say Amazon, but it's any of them, and at the same time, let Amazon keep their level of protection they need, so my data is protected. And then the answer that has been generally worked out is, in the US, there's an audit standard called a SOC 2, type 2, SOC 2, type 2. And to be an auditor or assessor for a SOC audit is very difficult to get that assessment. And all of the big cloud providers do these audits themselves for a variety of reasons. And what the agreement has become is you will share the results of that SOC audit with me. And then I will review the SOC audit and validate that it meets my physical security requirements. And we will treat the auditor as a trusted third party. And if you're a customer, doesn't matter how big or small you are of Amazon, et cetera, they will share those reports with you. It's not just the big banks or the big, the really big companies that get access to these. If you have an NDA, you're a customer, you can get a copy of it. They will happily share it with you. And so the workaround generally there is, okay, well, for the things that a SOC audit would cover, then we will accept that, but you need to review it on a generally annual or semi-annual basis to ensure that, the requirements are still being met, and if they're not, then just like anything else, you need to notify us, et cetera, just like any other, security issue that might come up. It's not like, it would be great if everyone was perfectly secure all the time. As Chad said earlier, that's not possible. It's not realistic. But there's processes. It's just like when a new security vulnerability comes out and a patch needs to be issued. It's not like, if you have an outsourcer, you're not like, I'm not going to do business with you, until you patch it. But you might say, you have 4 weeks to patch it or 2 weeks to patch it. You need to demonstrate you have a plan for doing it and stick to it, a remediation plan. And that's going to be the same thing if you turn up a physical security or an issue around the virtualization layer or whatever processes are involved. And this is sort of one of the ways you can make your auditors much happier with you is say, okay, I can't physically visit, I can't physically validate things, but I can get a report demonstrating it. Or if it's a SaaS provider, you can say, show me some screenshots of your Amazon console showing that you are in fact using an HSM. I mean, obviously I can't go to Amazon and look at that, but you can show me some visual evidence, compensating controls, if you will, or just some visual, some trackable, auditable methodology where I can see that those controls are being met. And then finally, identity. How do I establish that, when my users are logging in, how do I control who's logging in, who's doing what inside those applications? Providers will say, oh, you can authenticate with OAuth. No, you can't. OAuth is an authorization protocol. They use OAuth to maybe point to a single sign-on provider, like my friend Dave, Duo over here, or Ping, or using local authentication. Don't recommend the local authentication approach. If you're a large organization, you probably are already doing some sort of single sign-on using SAML or WS-Fed or both if you're large enough. Lucky you. Excuse me. The important thing here is that you really need to be able to establish to your auditors that whether it's your customers or your employees that are logging in the way they say they are, which generally means federation. And this is just a bonus in general. You don't want someone who's terminated going home and logging into your Amazon account and start deleting things. I'm pretty sure there's been a few breaches in the last couple of years with a rogue employee going home either before or after termination and engaging in destruction. You also need to be able to establish to your auditors things like, we don't let the root user log in ever, and we're using multi-factor authentication. Fortunately, most of the large providers do provide single sign-on type integrations, and this is definitely much more one of a just do it, not so much that it's a problem. Outsourcing's been around for a long time. Your auditors understand this. This is, I hate the term, but it's a best practice. The last thing you want is someone logging in and doing something and having no visibility into what they did. And these are, so all in all, these were sort of the high-level big issues that the banks and other large financials play is really understanding, how do I get to do this? How do I, take advantage of these very large cloud installations and do it in a sensible way. I didn't have a chance to dive into what most of us talk about is infrastructure as a service. Most of the software as a service vendors have the exact same issues. It's just that it's up to the software as a service provider to give you the evidence that they're doing it as opposed to you implementing something. But in terms of audit, in terms of regulators, it's all the same. The general issue with the regulators comes down is it is their jobs to be super, super paranoid. Most regulators and auditors I've spoken to make me look wild and crazy and, run in the breeze and play with the butterflies when it comes to security. And one of the important things to keep in mind is the regulators all know they're smarter than you are. It doesn't matter whether they are or aren't in reality. But it is their job as a regulator to make sure you're following the rules. They're the disciplinarians. It is their neck on the line. Like if you get caught out and the regulator signed off on things, they're the ones who are going to be in even more trouble than you are in most cases. So it's sort of like anytime you're dealing with an auditor or regulator, there's going to be a lot of education, helping them understand, particularly in environments where cloud has not yet been even written into regulations. It was only 5 years ago that the PCI Council had recommendations on how to use cloud successfully, if you wanted to do it. And it's sort of like the healthcare regulation in the US was the same. Anytime a new regulation comes out, it's usually quite a while before they have any concept of how to audit or review in a new environment, whether it's virtualization 10 years ago, cloud 5 years ago, serverless, which is the new crazy black whatever hotness in cloud and DevOps land. I guarantee none of the regulators are prepared to deal with serverless. I'm not even sure how we would deal with the serverless in a sensible way around some of the regulations due to lack of transparency stuff. It's really cool tech. It's probably just not there yet for financials, healthcare providers, et cetera. I'm happy to talk about that later, preferably over alcohol. And I see you caught up with the translators. And on that note, if you have questions, great. Otherwise, I'll be around for the rest of today and tomorrow. And thank you for the time.